Hey guys, how's it going? This is lecture number 7 and the second part of extinction events that we're going to learn about. So last lecture we looked at 2 of these first 5 extinction events, the Ordovician-Silurian and the Late Devonian. In today's lecture we're going to be, I'll do a little bit of a review on these 2 first extinction events and then move into the PT extinction, also known as the Great Dying. We'll get into the TJ extinction and then the KT extinction, that event that led to the extinction of most dinosaurs. So without further ado, let's do a little bit of review. The first 2 extinction events we learned about, the Ordovician-Silurian and the Late Devonian. We will get to the Permian-Triassic today next, but these first 2 extinction events were carried out over millions of years. So it's something very important to take note in. In the Ordovician-Silurian, there are several hypotheses, but the one leading hypothesis is that many volcanic eruptions ensued and the deposition of silicate rocks were released throughout Earth's terrestrial habitats. And with that, those silicate rocks actually sequester CO2. So the first 2 extinction events that we learn about actually have to do with the greenhouse effect. So the insulative gaseous layer in our atmosphere that actually insulates our planet. The thicker this blanket of gas is, the more insulative it is. So because these silicate rocks absorbed CO2, more heat actually escaped Earth's atmosphere and went into space, as opposed to being trapped in Earth's atmosphere and keeping our planet warm. So global cooling event ensued after the Ordovician, or during the Ordovician-Silurian event, and this caused the polar regions of our planet, the North Pole and the South Pole, to be engulfed in these huge ice sheets. The oceans shallowed, and the contents on the bottom of the ocean, there were heavy metals also deposited at the time. Many of these heavy metals were toxic to organisms living in these oceans, which is again another reason why many species went extinct during this time. Not only were there toxic metals in the bottom of these oceans, the temperature changed, right? The atmosphere changed, and because the oceans were so much shallower, they were more easily mixed. So much of these metals got mixed into the water column and became toxic to the organisms living in these systems. During this time, there wasn't that much going on in terrestrial habitats. So when you mess up the aquatic habitats, you're going to mess up most of the species on this planet, which is why and how the Ordovician-Silurian ensued. So here we look at this temperature figure. Again, the Ordovician-Silurian, about 450 million years ago, we have this sharp decrease in temperature due to those silicate rocks absorbing CO2 and Earth's heat escaping into space. When we move past the Ordovician-Silurian, you get into the Devonian, and yes, there was another extinction event that we call the Late Devonian, and the Late Devonian also has a sharp decrease in the planet's temperature. So in the Late Devonian, instead of silicate rocks sucking up CO2, plants sucked up CO2. So it was at this time where vascular tissue evolves. Because vascularity evolves in plants, plants are allowed to grow much more robustly, and the larger they grow, the more CO2 a plant actually requires to carry out photosynthesis. The larger you are, the more cells you must provide energy to. Plants, we know, they photosynthesize, they take in CO2, and they fix CO2 into sugars, right? So vascularity allowed more more products and more soil resources, and especially water, to be moved to the leaf tissue where photosynthesis occurred, right? And because of this, all this CO2 was absorbed. You get another decrease in the greenhouse effect because this insulative gas is being reduced, causing a cooling event. Again, the poles of our planet are engulfed in ice sheets, dense ice sheets. The oceans were much more shallow, just like the Ordovician Silurian. And over the course of 25 million years, so this extinction event took at least 20 million years. They think 25 million years to ensue. You get all these robust plant lineages that are doing great at this time. But over 25 million years, we have, tropical storms, washing much of these plant debris into these shallow oceans. And you get eutrophication happen, which is an excess of nutrients. When a body of water gets too many nutrients, you see algal blooms because the algae do great with those nutrients. Algae, yes, they produce oxygen as a byproduct of their photosynthesis, but these algal blooms eventually die, and they're sitting at the surface of water, right, where the sunlight is. And as soon as they die, they start to sink down the water column. Eventually, they find themselves on the bottom. And it is here that bacteria, and I use this term aerobic bacteria, aerobic organisms utilize oxygen in their metabolism. These aerobic bacteria are breaking down these plants, these single-celled plant structures at the bottom of water, aquatic habitats. And with that, because they utilize oxygen, they're actually sucking up all the oxygen in the water, and that creates anoxic conditions. We remember anoxic conditions are void or have very low amounts of oxygen. So the water column became anoxic during the Late Devonian. Because it took so long, because there was 25 million years of earthly changes, you get adaptations arise. So this is another common theme. Yes, many species go extinct, but when extinction events occur over very long periods, there are selection pressures that enable some adaptations to arise. One of these adaptations we looked at occurred in Tiktaalik, and this organism is a proto-amphibian. You can see it looks very fish-like. It has a fish-like head, except its head is a little bit different. It has these primitive-looking limbs. And with that being said, these organisms most definitely lived at the border of aquatic and terrestrial habitats. They were able to climb on land. They did have primitive lung structures, which again shows that if an extinction event occurs over long enough times, you're going to get adaptations, right? Like many carp that live today, carp can live in eutrophic anoxic conditions because they don't have to just depend on, passing the water in their environment over their gills to sequester oxygen. They can actually take a gulp from the surface. So carp can do this. That's why you see a lot of goldfish in straight up green eutrophic water with not much oxygen, because they can actually take a gulp of air. Tiktaalik certainly could take a gulp of air, can certainly probably use its lungs even more so than other species today that are more marine or more aquatic. So because of this extinction event, we get the first literal and figurative steps onto land by a vertebrate, right? So I think that is so cool. So on to the PT, the Permian-Triassic Extinction event, also known as the Great Dying. This occurred 25 million years ago. So there is a relatively long gap between the Late Devonian and the Permian-Triassic. More than 100 million years goes by until this another major extinction event. Now, the Great Dying, like its name suggests, has 95% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial species going extinct. Not many times do extinction events actually negatively affect both aquatic and terrestrial habitats, right? It's usually one or the other. In this instance, the Great Dying, both drastically different habitats were very much so altered to the point of many organisms not being able to withstand. There was so much biodiversity loss that the recovery of life on Earth took significantly longer compared to other extinction events. So it is, and through the fossil record, it looks as if it took at least 10 million years for life to actually rebound, which is a long time, right? The Great Dying was, again, most likely, a lot of evidence points to supervolcanoes that were erupting for not just 1 year, not just 10 years, but up to like a million years. Just think, like, we've never seen a supervolcano erupt. We've seen regular volcanoes erupt. Now think about a supervolcano that's erupting for more than a million years, right? This changes the atmosphere. Not only is this ensuing, but deep sea vents are too, releasing a lot of gas and a lot of heat. In deep sea vents, a lot of methane is released. This is a very powerful greenhouse gas. So the atmosphere, and we could see at the PT extinction, we could see a sharp increase in temperature. So, the atmosphere gets warmer, and because these deep sea vents are erupting so long, they're releasing heat. The entire oceans of this time are hotter than your hot tub, right? The entire ocean. So that is just an insane amount of energy that, needs to be utilized for that amount of temperature change in the ocean. So that's pretty wild. As you can tell, that is why 95% of marine organisms go extinct. I mean, what organisms can live in a hot tub? Not many. So the methane and other gases that were released from deep sea vents, they led to periods of hyperoxia and anoxia. So not only did the marine environments change in temperature, they changed in oxygen concentration, and this wasn't linear. It didn't go from anoxic to hyperoxic. It flip-flopped back and forth over millions of years, right? So there was very little stability in the amount of readily available oxygen. So hyperoxia is when an environment is super saturated with oxygen, and anoxia is our environments that have very low amounts of oxygen. So in addition to this, the ozone was stripped from Earth's atmosphere, and the planet was then bombarded with UV rays, which decimated the terrestrial inhabitants. So we know why the marine inhabitants were decimated, but now when we take this into consideration, there was no ozone at the time. Without an ozone, these harmful UV rays, right? UVC, UVB, UVA, all of these forms of UV radiation reach the surface of the ground. And if you don't have adaptations in place already to reflect UV radiation over long enough time scales, your species will develop mutations, deleterious mutations, and I mean, you can just die, within one life cycle. So we have, not a good scenario being set up for terrestrial organisms. Now, if you remember, in the beginning of the semester, I talked about scorpions and them reflecting UV radiation. So this is another reason, and this lineage of organisms these arthropods, especially from the Chelicerata, so spiders and scorpions, especially scorpions, they are so ancient. The reason why they're so ancient is because they do have these adaptations to withstand the PT extinction event. So they were crawling on land before this extinction event, and because they don't care about the ozone because they reflect UV radiation, they actually lived through this extinction event, which is really cool. Now, this is another reason why the PT extinction event was called the Great Dying is because insects are never really hit hard by many extinction events. In this case, the insects were hit extremely hard. So I think this actually builds a better understanding of why it took life so long to rebound. It's because insects carry out so many ecological functions. When it comes to pollination, right? When it comes to, obviously, pollination is the reproduction of plants facilitated by insects. We have, decomposition that many insects and larvae of mature insects, rework carbon back into ecosystems. Herbivory, they're food source for other organisms. They're predators on other organisms. So all these ecological interactions that insects take part in, now there's no more insects. Now, with a species, like a keystone group of species like the insects going extinct, many of them going extinct, it just takes so much longer for plants to get going again, fungi to get going again, other animals to get going again. So with that being said, insects are extremely important to the functioning of ecosystems on our planet. To kind of preface, later lectures, we're going to talk about our extinction event that we're associated with, and insects too are being decimated. So remember to think about obviously the past, but also the present at the same time. So the aftermath of the PT extinction event, we have these warm oceans that become so anoxic during certain times that anaerobic sulfur-reducing organisms, these sulfur-reducing bacteria, they start to dominate the chemistry of these oceans. Unfortunately for the species living at the time, these types of bacteria, these anaerobic sulfur-reducing bacteria, one of their byproducts is actually toxic hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide is a strong acid, and you have all these organisms that create a calcium shell, a calcium carbonate shell. These organisms are totally decimated, not only from the temperature changing, not only from the anoxic and oxic, hyperoxic conditions, but now the acidity of the oceans, because of these sulfur-reducing anaerobes, the acidity becomes so strong that these organisms cannot put on calcium carbonate without calcium carbonate redissolving back into the ocean. So the acidity, the temperature, and the oxygen of the time, and that's why 95% of marine species go extinct, right? So we know that it took 10 million years for life to rebound, but guess what? 50 million years after the PT extinction event, we have yet another extinction event. So pretty rough patch in Earth's history at this time. So on to the TJ extinction event, the Triassic-Jurassic extinction event, just 50 million years after the Great Dying. And here, a little bit alarming is that even though this is the second most recent extinction event of the 5, we don't know a lot about this one. So we know very little about this extinction event. There's been no asteroid crater that actually coincides with this point in time. So most likely, researchers kind of are thinking that volcanic eruptions that do coincide with the breakup of Pangea ensued. So plate tectonics, they do move gradually, but there are periods of time where plate tectonics move more robustly. And this is one of those times with all these plates moving around. There's a lot of geologic, interactions happening, and there's more volcanism. So as you guys have seen and known about Pangea, Pangea was this supercontinent, and it broke up around this time, allowing plumes and plumes of lava to reach the surface. And through this, 50% of all species on Earth went extinct. So again, the TJ extinction event, we don't know exactly how it ensued, but what we do know is that it opened up niches for the dinosaurs to take a hold of the planet. Now, it's at this time where we can date these fossils, and this obviously strengthens the hypothesis that these continents, this supercontinent existed. We have these fossils that you can find throughout this region across South America and Africa, and there's just no way that this organism would be able to exist in this place if Pangea was always broken up. And that goes for not just this organism, but many organisms, even more than what are depicted on the screen. Glossopteris is this really famous ancestral plant that a lot of paleobotanists are carrying out many studies to this day. I just listened to a podcast about a researcher from South Africa that actually looks at these fossils, which is so cool to me. You're going back in time, and you're, these continents that we see today, they were combined into Pangea, and all of these organisms, this is why you find fossils over here that are the same over here, and vice versa. So really, really cool. Again, really strong point of paleontologists and people studying rocks and the fossils contained within them, because they help us better understand our planet. So we know that because of the Triassic-Jurassic extinction event, this opened up niches for the dinosaurs to burst onto Earth's scene. So you can see this stark shift in the organisms at the time. Throughout the Triassic, you have many reptiles and amphibians doing really well. I also mentioned this in the earlier lectures, that dinosaurs, we were taught that they're reptiles. They had reptile-like characteristics, but they were their own group of organisms. The dinosaurs were not reptiles. And it's because of this extinction event, many of these organisms go extinct, and over the next few million years, you have dinosaurs really take hold in the Jurassic, right? So I absolutely love that. And we're going to have to know what a niche is for us to actually understand this statement. So an ecological niche is the living and non-living habitat that supplies the factors necessary for the existence of an organism. So here we're looking at two niche axes, temperature and precipitation. And these two niche axes are extremely important. Like many ecologists around the world, they can tell you what organisms are going to be present with just looking at these two factors, precipitation and temperature. Like, you're never gonna find a tropical plant that lives at the equator in the North Pole, right? Because it's clearly not gonna have the same the right temperature that it has, evolved to live in. And obviously, precipitation is actually, the polar regions actually have some of the driest places on the planet. So here, for example, these two niche axes explain the ecological niche of this frog species. Too dry or too cold, this species is not gonna be able to exist. So I really like the fact that I included living and non-living, also known as, again, this should, spark some past definitions in your head, abiotic versus biotic interactions. So abiotic interactions are non-living. Precipitation and temperature are very important factors. They are not living. A living factor would be its food source. So let's just say, for simplicity's sake, that this organism eats a lot of house flies, right? So Diptera is the order of flies that it feeds on, and these organisms, that's a living factor. So we can have another niche axis, and we can say, number of house flies. And outside of that number, if there's too few, that this species isn't going to be able to exist. So it's really important to note that an ecological niche is actually composed of an infinite number of factors. There are some factors that are more important. For example, precipitation and temperature are always going to be important, but an infinite number. The closer you look at an organism and its requirements, the more niche axes you will actually soon realize. So this is an ecological niche. After this extinction event, after the Jurassic Extinction event, there was all this niche space available, right? Because these organisms went extinct, and it's just a matter of time until dinosaurs start to fill in those open niches. So on through this period of punctuated evolution and diversification, we get so many different dinosaur species that is brought to a pretty much abrupt halt with this asteroid impact. The Cretaceous-Tertiary Extinction event, also known as the KT extinction event. It occurred 65 million years ago, and overnight we have a drastic change in Earth's atmosphere and Earth's biological systems, right? Overnight. So unlike many of the extinction events that we learn about that ensued over several millions of years, KT extinction event, just like that, asteroid barrels into Earth. If you were even remotely around this impact, you were vaporized. But we're soon going to learn that this, launched so much debris into the air, blocked out the sun for a year, and that's known as a nuclear winter, and we'll get into that. So how do we know for sure that it was an asteroid? Well, interestingly enough, if you find a layer of rock wherever you are around the world, because this asteroid's, the deposits of this asteroid settled all around the world. So it doesn't matter where you go. If you go to layers of rock that have been dated to 65 million years, you will see a rich abundance of iridium. Now, iridium is a rare earth metal, but it is abundant in asteroids, right? So this asteroid that was full of iridium smashed into Earth, and it's broken up into all these tiny particles that get flown around into Earth's atmosphere. Those iridium molecules settle, and that is why when we date rock, that's 65 million years, no matter where you are in the world, you find an abundance of this rare earth metal. This massive asteroid was either 10 to 15 kilometers wide, so about the size of a small town, a medium-sized town. Pretty big asteroid. So this is a really cool example of the layer of iridium. This rock right on this this border here, this is dated to 65 million years. And it's so cool. We have the deposition of iridium because of this asteroid. Even more concrete evidence. The Chicxulub crater we found in 1990 off the Yucatan Peninsula, and researchers identified this massive oval crater that had an average diameter of almost 200 kilometers wide. So a 15 kilometer asteroid creates a huge crater that's almost 200 kilometers wide. Now, after doing research and studying when this was formed, it coincides exactly with the KT extinction event, and it really strengthened the hypothesis that this extinction was in fact caused by an impact. Now, the energy released in this impact it's honestly impossible for me to fathom. The one way that you can fathom it is to understand how much energy goes into an atomic bomb. So there is a hypothesized number by like physicists of the time and astrophysicists. Astrophysicists came up with this discharge was around 100 teratons of TNT. So that is actually 1 billion times the energy of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So as you know, the first two bombs we used in war, unfortunately, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those were some of the smallest atomic bombs ever detonated, ever. So even though they were massive, and you can see these first two bombs still rivaled Mount Everest, you have to multiply these explosions by 1 billion. Okay, and my little brain just can't do that. What's kind of crazy about this figure is, this bomb to the right that was detonated in 1961, right? That was 50 megatons. So, 1,000 megatons is 1 teraton, and this was 100 teratons, right? It's crazy. And it also kind of is alarming that, what do, bombs today can probably, without a doubt, just, neutralize the planet, which I just wish we didn't have that power. But regardless, it is a useful tool to look at the scale of these asteroid impacts. So there were both immediate and long-term alterations in Earth's environment. This brief but intense pulse of infrared radiation killed those organisms that were, relatively close, speaking, to this impact. Global debris deposited by this impact contained enough soot that the entire terrestrial biosphere was burned. So so it's not just the impact that launches debris into the air. This energy actually causes fires around the world this smoke and this soot from not only the impact but fires is put into the atmosphere, and this blocks out the sun. And this blocked out the sun for at least 1 year, right? And we actually call this a nuclear winter effect, right? So this is what happens when a huge impact happens on Earth. You get all this debris, especially when you get like these massive, wide-scale, widespread global fires. You get all this soot in the air. There's no sun reaching the surface anymore, right? So this is called a nuclear winter effect. So much of the planet up in flames. This soot blocks out the sun. Debris blocks the energy from the sun, and you have an extremely low photosynthetic output, as well as global cooling, right? So the entire planet gets cold for this year because there's just no sunlight reaching the surface, and plants, they're dying, right? Without sun, most plants cannot carry on. Maybe there were some plants that had enough carbon stored, but many plants are really hit hard. So how long was this nuclear winter, and how do plants actually come back into Earth's scene? Like, if all the plants died, we would think that, it would take millions of years, or even, maybe half of a billion years for plants to evolve again. But this isn't the case, right? Even though many plants do die at this time, plants have this ability. Many plants, they do actually produce seeds. Many of those seeds, the next year when sunshine does make its way to the surface, many of those seeds could germinate. So there is a seed bank being deposited and maintained by living plants. And hopefully, if this does happen again, there will be enough of a seed bank for plants to reestablish relatively soon. So plants, they could live after that year. Obviously, they didn't do good for a year, but they germinate right when the sun comes back out. Animals, however, they do not have this ability. So animals depend on living plant tissues. And many of those animals that depend on living plant tissues, they did not fare well. And this is an ecological term I want us to understand: bottom-up control. Bottom-up control is this understanding that without plants, you're not going to have herbivores. Without herbivores, you're not going to have carnivores, and then you're not going to have top predators. So plants have this bottom-up control on ecosystems that without them, they just don't, the ecosystem cannot function at all. So if some organisms did manage to survive the initial impact, the global fires, the cooling planet, then they were soon faced with another predicament: no food. There's no plants living here, so all these giant herbivores, right? Because, dinosaurs, during this time, the evolution of the largest terrestrial organisms evolved, right? And they were herbivores, and without huge, plant biomass, they're not going to be able to feed themselves, right? So starvation ensued for many of these large herbivores. Now, another reoccurring theme of this unit is the evolution of birds. We learned about Archaeopteryx, and we learned that birds actually are dinosaurs that didn't go extinct, right? So over the next few millions of years, there was a selection towards small body size. So obviously large organisms, like large dinosaurs, went extinct after the KT impact, right? There's no plants, there's not enough food. Guess what? You are dying. When the large herbivores die, it's just a matter of time until the large carnivores die. But it is these small little raptors that do okay. And obviously that first year is tough, but because they're small, they don't have to eat a lot, right? Yes, they might have a relatively high metabolism, but they're going to need nowhere near the amount of calories this Brachiosaurus needs on a day-to-day basis. So there was a selection, natural selection towards smaller body size. Now there was also selection towards certain feeding ecology, right? So and we're going to learn two different types of feeding ecology. We have generalists and we have specialists. So a generalist feeder, like its name suggests, they don't have to eat one specific food, right? So this makes sense that during this time there was selection towards generalist feeders, right? They can eat whatever kind of was available to them. Specialist feeders did not do good at this time. A specialist feeder needs just like one type of food. For example, we know pandas, they eat bamboo. If all the bamboo on the planet goes extinct, they're going to have a much harder time in the wild living, right? So specialist feeders did not fare well, but generalist feeders, there was a selection towards generalist feeders, and there was a selection towards carrion feeders. Another red term, carrion is dead organic like animals. So a carrion feeder is something like maggots, right? And this bird who's eating this dead rabbit right here. So these are carrion feeders, organisms that specialize in dead animals. Guys, think about the huge dinosaurs that died during this time. Think about the hundreds of tons of meat just rotting there. So carrion feeders, they managed really well, especially generalist carrion feeders. And again, we see how extinction events, they open up niches for new species to evolve. Just like when many amphibians and reptiles go extinct before dinosaurs make their way onto the scene, here, after the dinosaurs go extinct, another group of organism that is this tiny shrew-like organism that fed on insects, that actually laid eggs, that was a generalist, it was nocturnal. This organism actually gives rise and is the ancestor of all modern day mammals. So mammals, without the KT extinction event, mammals do not recolonize and fill in those open niches that dinosaurs leave behind. So it actually makes sense when we look at these selection pressures, right? Small body size, generalist feeder, carrion feeders. These three things make so much sense when we look at the organisms that do make it out of this KT extinction event. So we have this lineage, right, that gives rise to the three branches of mammals. We have monotremes, the platypus, and echidnas. These mammals actually lay eggs. They have a lot of reptilian characteristics, and they have more of these ancient characteristics that the original ancestor had. These there are therapsids, we call these. So to this day, there are mammals that lay eggs, believe it or not. You guys know marsupials. Marsupials, they give birth to really tiny looking undeveloped embryos that then develop in pouches outside of the mother's body. Those are marsupials. And then we have placental mammals. easily the most successful lineage of mammals. Every other mammal that isn't a monotreme or a marsupial is a placental mammal, and these truly colonize and take over all of Earth's niches and do really successful over the next 65 million years into present time, right? So it's this therapsid organism that gives rise to the evolution of all these different mammals, which I absolutely love learning about. I love the how the evolution and the ancestor of elephants looked like this, and through time we have all these different forms of the elephants. Same thing with the horses. So cool. Changing with their earthly environment, dominating with all these open niches. Eventually, we finally get hominids. So I don't like when people say that we came from monkeys, because guess what? Monkeys are extant species. Look, chimpanzees are living to this day. We didn't come from chimpanzees. We share a common ancestor with them. So I never liked that. That kind of suggests that evolution's like goal oriented, and like it honestly suggests that humans are superior in every way compared to other animals. Guess what? We are, both extant species. We're both just as evolved. We just share a common ancestor. Around 5 million years ago, there are bones that then diverge into two separate lineages that give rise to the ancestors of chimpanzees and ultimately chimpanzees, and then to all these organisms, all these different hominid organisms, eventually into the genus Homo, and we get Homo sapiens. This is Neanderthals. And it's really crazy. Human evolution really does. We're a very new species onto the Earth scene compared to how long the planet has been around. We came into existence as our species around 200,000 years ago, which is literally a snap of a finger ago. And just think, there was one time where I've heard from specialists and people, anthropologists. I've heard that there were 7 hominid species living at the same exact time all across Earth. Right? There's only one genus of Homo alive to this day. That's Homo sapien. Just think though, there were all these different species of this genus Homo, and Australopithecus, which is a relatively related hominid as well, competing and fighting with each other and battling for resources. Some researchers say there was 7 living at once. This depiction shows at around from 2 to 1.5 million years ago. 1, 2, 3, 4. This shows that there was at least 5 organisms, very similar, very closely related organisms living at the same time. So I think that's really cool. So with these extinction events, that leads us into the Anthropocene, which is the 6th major extinction event. Before I'll get into that next lecture, but I thought this was really cool, and really a cool way to show you guys how evolution and extinction events kind of drive evolutionary processes, and how they're a natural occurrence, but also we're going to learn that these are kind of unnatural too, when you get an organism that can change its environment knowingly. So I will leave it at that today. Thank you for your attention. If you have any suggestions or emails or concerns, let me know. Thank you for your attention, and I will catch you on the next video. See you later.